Rancher inherits a deadly cabin and finds Apache girl hanged inside. Jacob Miller had always lived a simple life. A rancher by trade, he was used to hard work and long days under the scorching sun. He had seen his fair share of adversity, from rough winters to unpredictable cattle markets, but he had never expected something like this. The letter came one gray morning, the kind of letter that seemed more like a weight on his chest than a piece of news. His eyes narrowed as he read the words, written in formal, old-fashioned handwriting. It was from a lawyer, someone Jacob had never heard of, informing him of an inheritance. The words, "You have inherited a cabin," seemed strange to him, and the letter went on to explain that the cabin was located in a remote area, far away from town. At first, Jacob thought about ignoring it. What did he need with a cabin in the middle of nowhere? He already had his hands full with his own ranch, and the thought of taking on something else seemed ridiculous. But as he folded the letter and tucked it into his coat pocket, something about it gnawed at him. The curiosity began to settle in. He had heard tales of a long-lost relative, an uncle he'd never met. This could be his chance to learn more about his family history or perhaps uncover some long-forgotten piece of the past. That evening, after a long day of tending to his cattle, Jacob sat by the fire and thought about the cabin. It seemed too strange to ignore. Something about the idea of inheriting an old forgotten property intrigued him. Maybe it was the mystery of it, or maybe it was just the feeling of needing to do something different. Either way, he decided to go. The next morning, Jacob saddled his horse and prepared for the journey. The cabin was located at the edge of a dense forest, deep in the hills where the land grew rough and untamed. It wasn't an easy place to get to, and he knew it would take him hours to reach. But that was part of the allure. The idea of venturing into an unfamiliar part of the world filled him with a strange excitement. As he rode through the open plains, the wind in his hair, Jacob couldn't help but wonder what awaited him at the end of this journey. The roads grew narrower as he ventured further, the familiar landscapes of his ranch slowly disappearing behind him. The trees started to grow thicker, their shadows stretching long across the path. The quietness of the land seemed unnatural, almost as if it was holding its breath. By the time he reached the cabin, the sky was dimming, and a heavy fog rolled in. Jacob could hardly see a thing in the mist, but the silhouette of the cabin slowly began to take shape. The cabin looked abandoned, its wooden walls aged and cracked by the passage of time. Weeds and vines had overtaken the area, curling around the structure like the arms of the earth itself. The windows were dark, their glass shattered, or missing entirely. The roof sagged, its wooden beams giving way to the weight of the years. It was clear that no one had lived here for a long time. Jacob tied his horse to a nearby tree and approached the cabin. As he stepped onto the creaky porch, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The place felt like it had been forgotten by time, as if it had been left to decay without anyone even noticing. He pushed the door open, and it groaned in protest. The interior was dimly lit by the weak light filtering in through the broken windows. Dust hung in the air, undisturbed by human presence. The room smelled musty, and there was a heaviness in the air, a feeling of neglect. Jacob stepped inside cautiously, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. The floorboards creaked under his weight, as if the cabin itself was warning him to be careful. The furniture was old, covered in thick layers of dust. A fireplace stood cold and empty at one end of the room, its stone hearth crumbling with age. The room felt oppressive, heavy with the silence of abandonment. He walked further into the cabin, drawn by an inexplicable force. There was something here, something that tugged at him. As he passed through the room, his eyes caught a glimpse of something strange. A door, hidden in the corner, partially obscured by an old wardrobe. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He had thought the cabin was empty, but now he wondered if there was something more to it, something hidden away. With a deep breath, Jacob approached the door. It was old, the wood splintered and cracked, but it seemed to have been used recently. His hand gripped the handle, and for a moment he hesitated. What if there was someone inside? What if he wasn't alone? The thought made him pause, but his curiosity got the better of him. With a quiet push, he opened the door. Inside was a small room, its walls bare except for a few scattered remnants of old furniture. But it was the centerpiece of the room that caught Jacob's attention. A rope hung from the ceiling, tied in a tight loop. Jacob's blood ran cold. The sight sent a chill straight to his bones. His eyes widened as he looked around the room, taking in the details. The wooden beams above the rope were darkened with age, but there was something else, something he couldn't put his finger on, that made him uneasy. His gaze slowly moved to the floor, where a dark stain spread beneath the rope. Jacob's throat tightened as he stepped closer. The room seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't explain, and the silence became deafening. Then his eyes fell on something else, an old piece of fabric crumpled on the ground. His heart pounded in his chest. It looked like a dress. A woman's dress. Jacob's mind raced. Who had been here? What had happened? Why had someone hung a rope in this room? And what was the significance of the dress? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden creak behind him. The door to the room slammed shut on its own, startling him. Jacob whirled around, his pulse quickening, but there was nothing there. The silence returned, heavier than before. He felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end as he stepped back, carefully making his way out of the room. His mind was reeling with questions. He had to know more. Who had been here before him? Who was the girl? And what had led to this dreadful scene? The eerie presence in the cabin seemed to weigh on him, as though the very walls were holding on to a dark secret. The feeling of being watched crept up on him as he stepped back outside. The air was thick, and the fog had settled deeper into the land. The cabin, now standing before him in its full crumbling form, seemed less like an inheritance and more like a trap. What was it that drew him here? And what had happened to the girl? Jacob Miller didn't know the answers yet, but as the sun began to set, he made a silent vow. He would uncover the truth. He would find out who had lived here, why the cabin had been abandoned, and who the girl was. This deadly cabin had its secrets, and Jacob wasn't about to leave until he knew them all. The eerie silence around him only made his resolve stronger. Whatever had happened in this place, he was going to discover it. Jacob stood outside the cabin, the air thick with fog, as his mind swirled with questions. What had happened here? Who had been the girl hanging from the rope? Why was this place abandoned? He tried to shake the eerie feeling that clung to him like the damp fog in the air. The cabin, once just a property he had inherited, had now become a mystery he could not ignore. The silence of the land seemed to weigh on him, as if everything around him was waiting for something to happen. The night had come quickly, and Jacob realized it would be unsafe to stay out here in the dark. He tied his horse to a nearby tree not far from the cabin and made his way back to the horse's stable. The cabin loomed behind him, casting long dark shadows that seemed to follow him. His mind kept racing as he worked to secure the area around his horse. Every sound, the rustling of the trees, the distant cry of an owl, sounded much louder than it should have. Even the quiet of the land felt oppressive. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. That night, as Jacob lay awake in the small room of the cabin, the silence seemed to grow louder. He lay on a worn cot by the broken window, the cold air creeping in from the gaps in the wooden frame. His eyes stared at the ceiling, but his mind was far from resting. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside made him jump. He had never been one to fear the unknown, but the energy in this place felt wrong, like the cabin itself was alive, holding on to the past, unwilling to let go. He closed his eyes, trying to push the thoughts away, but sleep didn't come easily. It wasn't just the cabin that troubled him. It was the unanswered questions that gnawed at him. Who had lived here? What had happened to the girl he had found hanging in the small room? Her presence seemed to linger, like an echo he couldn't escape. It felt as though she had been trying to tell him something, but her voice had been silenced long ago. The next morning, Jacob decided to explore the surrounding area. He couldn't simply leave without trying to understand the story behind the cabin, and he knew he had to find answers. The town was only a short ride away, so he gathered his belongings and set out. hoping someone there might have information. The ride into town was long, and the road seemed to stretch on forever, the landscape changing from thick woods to wide open fields. As he reached the outskirts of the town, Jacob couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. There were no children playing in the streets, no families going about their business. The town felt almost as forgotten as the cabin. A few old buildings lined the road, their paint peeling and windows dark. It was as if the place had been frozen in time. Jacob tied his horse outside the general store, stepping into the cool shade as he approached the door. Inside, the store was dusty and dim, filled with old supplies and a strange smell of something forgotten. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with thick glasses, looked up when Jacob entered. The man's eyes narrowed, and he gave a small grunt of acknowledgement. "I haven't seen you around before," the shopkeeper said, his voice gravelly. "You new here?" "I've just inherited a cabin outside of town," Jacob replied, trying to keep his tone casual. "I'm trying to find out more about it. Thought maybe someone here might know something." The shopkeeper frowned, his fingers running along the counter as if he was trying to decide whether to speak. Finally, he sighed, leaning closer. "You don't want to go poking around there, boy," the shopkeeper warned. "That cabin's been abandoned for years." No good comes from places like that. Jacob raised an eyebrow, sensing there was more to the story. Why? What happened there? The shopkeeper hesitated again, casting a quick glance toward the back of the store as if making sure no one else could hear. Then, in a low voice, he spoke. "Many years ago, a man named Samuel Hargrave owned that cabin. He wasn't a kind man. He had his share of trouble with the locals, but no one ever dared speak out against him. They say he took an Apache girl, kept her there in that cabin. No one knows exactly what happened to her, but she disappeared one day. Some folks say she tried to escape. Others say she was punished. After she vanished, no one ever went near that cabin. People started to believe it was cursed, the land around it too." Jacob listened closely, his mind turning over the information. He hadn't expected such a dark history. He had assumed the cabin was simply forgotten over time, a relic of the past. But it seemed there was more to it than that. Samuel Hargrave, the man who had owned the cabin, sounded like a cruel figure. And the Apache girl, her name was still a mystery, but Jacob was sure there was more to her story. There had to be. The shopkeeper paused for a moment, then leaned back, wiping his hands on his apron. "You should just leave it be," the man added, almost pleading. "Some things are better left undisturbed." Jacob's resolve only grew stronger. He had to know more. The girl in the cabin, the mysterious past, everything about this situation pulled at him. He couldn't just walk away, not without trying to uncover the truth.
"I appreciate the advice," Jacob said, his voice firm.
"But I'm going back to the cabin today. I have to know what happened." The shopkeeper shook his head, clearly frustrated but offering no further words of warning. Jacob left the store, his mind set. He wasn't going to leave until he got the answers he was looking for. The girl deserved that much, at least. Back at the cabin, the atmosphere was heavier than ever. The fog had lifted slightly, but the place still felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on him. Jacob felt a deep sense of urgency as he entered the cabin once again. The morning light barely penetrated the gloom inside, and the broken furniture seemed to loom over him like silent witnesses to a forgotten tragedy. He couldn't help but look at the corner where the rope had hung, the spot where the girl had been left to die. As Jacob walked through the cabin examining every corner, his thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, a soft rustle, as if something had moved. His heart raced, and he spun around looking for the source. There was nothing, just the same empty silence. But he felt it again, that presence, as if someone was watching him. His gaze landed on the fireplace. He hadn't noticed it before, but there seemed to be something tucked into the corner near the hearth, an old, weathered book. Jacob crouched down and picked it up, dusting off the cover. It was a journal, its pages yellowed with age. Carefully he opened it, and as his eyes scanned the words, he realized he had found something important. This was no ordinary journal. It was Hargrave's, and it was about to tell him the rest of the story. Jacob held the old journal in his hands, its worn cover a testament to its age. His heart raced as he flipped through the fragile pages, each one filled with faded ink. The more he read, the more he realized just how much he had uncovered about the man who had once lived in the cabin. The man responsible for the tragedy that had unfolded here. Samuel Hargrave, the man who had owned the cabin, had kept meticulous records of his life and actions, but it was clear from the journal that he was no ordinary man. His words were filled with a mix of pride and arrogance, as if he saw himself as someone above reproach, untouchable. The journal's pages were filled with stories of Hargrave's early years, his rise to power in the region, and his eventual move to the cabin that had now become Jacob's inheritance. As Jacob read, he learned that Hargrave had been a rancher, a man of wealth and influence, but also a man with a dark side. He had been known for his cruelty to those who crossed him, and it was said that he had no patience for weakness. The journal hinted at a strained relationship with his family, with his neighbors, and even with the very land he had come to call home. It was as Jacob turned to a new section of the journal, marked with a worn leather bookmark, that he found the part that made his blood run cold. The entries began to detail the arrival of a young girl, an Apache girl, who had been brought to the cabin under mysterious circumstances. Hargrave's tone changed when he spoke of her. At first he referred to her as nothing more than an asset, something to be used for his benefit. But as the entries continued, it became clear that he had become obsessed with her, though in a twisted and unhealthy way. The journal described the girl's quiet demeanor and the way she would often disappear into the woods for days at a time, returning only when she was forced back to the cabin. Hargrave's words were filled with contempt, but there was also a sense of longing, a desire that he couldn't quite suppress. He spoke of the girl's beauty, her strength, and her stubbornness. He admired her spirit, but he also hated it, as if her independence was something he couldn't control. Jacob felt a deep sense of sadness as he read these words. He could feel the weight of the girl's presence in every line, could almost hear her silent struggle. It was clear that she had been trapped in this cabin, not just by the physical walls, but by the cruel intentions of the man who held her captive. Hargrave's obsession with her grew over time, and his journal revealed the lengths he went to in order to keep her under his control. But the entries took a darker turn when Jacob reached the final few pages. The last few entries were disjointed and erratic, as if Hargrave had begun to lose his grip on reality. The tone of the writing shifted from calculated and cold to frantic and desperate. Hargrave spoke of the girl's attempts to escape, of her running away into the wilderness, and of his pursuit to bring her back. He was angry, frustrated, but also afraid that she would leave him for good, that she would escape from his clutches. The final entry was the most chilling of all. It was written in a scrawl, almost unreadable, but the meaning was clear. Hargrave had caught the girl, and in his fury he had done something unforgivable. The words on the page suggested that he had been on the verge of letting her go, that he had realized the depth of his wrongs, but something had stopped him. What had happened in those final moments between them? Jacob couldn't be sure, but it was clear that Hargrave had never truly been able to let the girl go. The journal ended abruptly, the last words unfinished, as if Hargrave had been interrupted or had lost his ability to write altogether. Jacob sat back, the journal heavy in his hands, the weight of its contents settling in his chest. He couldn't understand what had driven Hargrave to treat the girl so terribly, to keep her confined to that cabin. But one thing was certain. The girl, whoever she was, had been a victim of something far worse than he could have imagined. Her spirit, it seemed, still lingered in the cabin, a silent reminder of the past that had been buried here. He sat there for a long time, the journal resting in his lap as he thought about what to do next. He knew he couldn't just leave the cabin without knowing the full story. There had to be more to the girl's fate, something he hadn't uncovered yet. But how could he find it? He had already explored the cabin, read the journal, and spoken to the townspeople. Yet the answers still seemed to elude him. Jacob decided to return to the town the following day, hoping that someone else might know more about the girl's past. The shopkeeper had told him to leave the cabin alone, but Jacob couldn't do that. He felt a responsibility to the girl, to the memory of what had happened here. He couldn't just walk away from the truth. When he arrived in town the next morning, the place felt even quieter than it had before. The streets were empty, the buildings dark and still. Jacob tied his horse outside the general store and walked inside. The shopkeeper was there, but this time his face was different, softer, more resigned. Jacob didn't waste any time. He approached the counter, placing the journal on the surface. The shopkeeper glanced at it, then at Jacob. "You've been reading it, haven't you?" the man asked, his voice low. Jacob nodded. "I need to know what happened to her." "The Apache girl." The shopkeeper sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the past had finally caught up with him. "There's more to the story than you think," he said slowly, his voice tinged with sadness. "That girl, Naya, she wasn't just anyone. She was part of a larger conflict, one that most people in town didn't want to acknowledge. She was caught in the middle of it, and Hargrave, well, he was part of the reason it all happened." The shopkeeper went on to explain that the land around the cabin had once been the site of a long-standing feud between the local settlers and the Apache tribe. Hargrave had been involved in that conflict, taking the girl as a prisoner after a skirmish. Over time, as tensions rose between the two groups, Naya had become a symbol of the hatred and violence that had consumed the region. Jacob listened intently, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the girl had been caught in a cycle of violence that she had never asked for. Her death, her fate, it wasn't just the result of one man's actions, but of a much larger history of pain and suffering that had shaped the lives of everyone involved. The shopkeeper paused, looking at Jacob with a mixture of regret and understanding. "Sometimes the past refuses to let go," he said quietly. "And when it comes to Naya, it's not just her spirit that haunts this place. It's the memory of everything that came before her." Jacob nodded, the weight of the story settling on his shoulders. He had come to the town seeking answers, but what he had found was more complicated than he had imagined. The girl, Naya, had been part of something much bigger, a tragedy that stretched far beyond the cabin she had been trapped in. As Jacob left the store, the journal tucked safely under his arm, he felt the burden of what he had learned. He knew that the past could never truly be erased, but he also knew that he couldn't walk away from it. The cabin, the girl, and the story that had unfolded there. It was all part of something much larger, something that needed to be remembered. Jacob stood at the edge of the cabin, staring out into the vast landscape. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, his heart heavy with everything he had uncovered over the past few days. The more he learned, the more the mystery seemed to grow, and the more he felt a deep sense of responsibility to understand what had truly happened in this place. The Apache girl, Naya, had been caught in a web of violence and tragedy, and her story was one that had to be told. The town's shopkeeper had given him a glimpse into the past, but Jacob knew there was more. He needed to find out what had happened to Naya in the end, what had become of her after she was taken from her people, and why her story had been lost in time. It was clear that Samuel Hargrave's involvement with her was more than just that of a cruel captor. There were layers to their relationship that Jacob hadn't fully unraveled yet. The following morning, Jacob set out once more, determined to find the final piece of the puzzle. He couldn't stop thinking about the journal. Hargrave had written about Naya with a twisted mix of obsession and regret. But there were still too many gaps, too many unanswered questions. Had Naya managed to escape? Had she died in the cabin? Or had something else occurred? The silence surrounding her death was almost as loud as the rope she had been found hanging from. This time, Jacob didn't go to the town. He didn't visit anyone else. Instead, he returned to the cabin, hoping that by being there, in the place where Naya had lived, he might find something that would explain the rest of the story. The morning fog was thick as he approached, wrapping the cabin in an almost suffocating blanket. As he stepped inside, the familiar musty air greeted him, and the floorboards creaked under his boots. He moved through the cabin slowly, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, looking for something he had missed before. Jacob's eyes fell on the small room where he had found the rope, and the unease he had felt on his first day here returned. He stepped forward, and his gaze landed on the floor beneath the spot where the rope had once hung. Something was different. The dark stain that had been there before seemed fainter, as if time had washed it away. But there was something else, a faint outline, like a piece of fabric, tucked beneath the floorboards. Jacob's heart quickened. Could it be something important? He knelt down and gently lifted the floorboard, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled it away. Underneath he found a small bundle of cloth, wrapped tightly in old, faded fabric. With careful hands, Jacob unwrapped the bundle. Inside he found an old necklace, its beads worn but still intact. The necklace was simple, nothing extravagant, but it felt significant, as though it had been carefully kept. The beads were smooth and polished, each one unique, and Jacob immediately felt a deep connection to them, as though they held a piece of the past that had been forgotten. But it wasn't just the necklace that caught his attention. There was also a small note, folded neatly and tucked into the fabric. Jacob unfolded the note, his heart racing as he read the delicate handwriting. It was a message, written by someone long gone, and it wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, but the words were clear. To whoever finds this, know that I tried to keep her safe. I tried to protect her, but in the end I couldn't. She deserved better than this. Please, do not forget her. Remember her and make sure the world knows her story. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as he reread the words. It was a simple message, but it held so much weight. It wasn't from Hargrave. This note was written by someone else, someone who had known the girl, someone who had cared for her in a way that Hargrave never had. The message was a plea for justice, a plea for Naya's story to be heard. Jacob's eyes scanned the room again, and suddenly, everything seemed clearer. He spent the next few hours carefully combing through the cabin, hoping to find something else, another clue, another piece of the puzzle. But the cabin held its secrets tightly. There were no more hidden messages, no more notes, no more answers. Jacob stood in the center of the room, the necklace in his hands, the note in his pocket. The stillness of the place felt heavier now. He realized that the cabin itself was more than just a structure. It was a prison for the memories of those who had been trapped within it. As Jacob stood there, lost in thought, he heard a faint sound, a soft, distant cry, like the wind whispering through the trees. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Was it the wind? Or was it something else? Jacob stepped forward, his hand instinctively reaching for the door. The sound came again, louder this time, and Jacob knew it wasn't just the wind. It was something else, something more personal. He stepped outside, the cool air rushing to greet him as he walked toward the woods that surrounded the cabin. The fog was beginning to lift, and the forest was bathed in a pale, ghostly light. The trees seemed to sway in time with the wind, their branches creaking as if in protest. Jacob felt a shiver run down his spine. The sound grew louder as he moved deeper into the woods, almost as if the earth itself was trying to speak to him. Jacob walked for what felt like hours, following the sound, letting it guide him. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he felt compelled to continue. The landscape shifted, and soon he found himself at the edge of a small clearing. The trees opened up to reveal a quiet stream, its water glistening in the soft light of the afternoon. And there, by the edge of the water, Jacob saw something he hadn't expected. A figure stood at the far side of the stream, watching him. The figure was tall and thin, draped in a simple robe that blended into the landscape. At first, Jacob thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps his mind playing tricks on him. But as he approached, the figure remained there, unmoving, like a ghost from the past. Jacob called out, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned and began to walk away, vanishing into the trees as if it had never been there. Jacob stood frozen for a moment, the air thick with the presence of something he couldn't quite understand. Was it Naya's spirit? Or was it just his imagination, worn thin by the eerie atmosphere of the cabin and the weight of the past? Jacob didn't know, but one thing was certain. He had found something more than just a house. The cabin had opened a door, not just to the past, but to something deeper. The mystery of Naya's life and death was far from over, and Jacob knew that he couldn't leave until he had uncovered the full story. The necklace in his pocket and the note in his heart were just the beginning. There was more to Naya's story, and he wasn't going to stop until he had found it. As Jacob walked back toward the cabin, the woods behind him seemed to watch, as if the trees themselves were waiting for him to return. The answers were out there, hidden in the land, in the memory of those who had lived and died. Jacob knew that finding the truth was his only path forward. The past had a way of calling out to those who were willing to listen, and Jacob Miller was ready to hear its message. Jacob sat in the quiet cabin, the soft light of the setting sun filtering through the broken windows. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him each moment he spent there, drawing him deeper into the mystery that had become his responsibility. The discoveries he had made, the journal, the necklace, the note, and the strange figure in the woods, had only led to more questions. Yet he couldn't walk away now. Something about this place, about Naya's story, felt unfinished. It was like a puzzle, and Jacob was determined to put it together. He had learned much in the last few days. He had learned about Samuel Hargrave's dark past, his obsessive nature, and his twisted sense of control. But even more, Jacob had discovered a girl named Naya, who had been caught in the middle of a violent struggle. She had been more than just a prisoner. She had been a symbol of something much larger, something that Jacob was only beginning to understand. The figure he had seen in the woods earlier that day lingered in his mind. Was it Naya's spirit, or had he simply imagined it? He couldn't be sure, but the feeling that he was being watched had never left him. It was as if the very land around him held on to memories that refused to be forgotten. Every step Jacob took seemed to echo the footsteps of those who had walked here before him.
With the journal still in his hands, Jacob decided to leave the cabin for the evening.
He needed to clear his mind, to step away from the weight of the past, if only for a little while. He mounted his horse and rode slowly through the woods, allowing the rhythmic sound of the hooves against the ground to calm his thoughts. The forest, though still heavy with mist, felt slightly more peaceful now. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trees, and the air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and earth. As he rode, Jacob thought about the things he had learned from the townspeople. The shopkeepers' warnings, the whispers of the past, they all painted a picture of a community that had learned to ignore the darker aspects of its history. People didn't want to talk about the old feuds, the violence, the tension that had existed between the settlers and the native tribes. The land had seen so much suffering, and it seemed that over time, everyone had simply tried to forget. But Jacob knew he couldn't forget. He had to honor Naya's memory, to uncover the truth that had been hidden for so long. He rode deeper into the woods, unsure of where he was going. The path grew narrower, the trees denser, and the silence around him felt almost oppressive. It was as if the woods themselves were trying to tell him something. Just as he was about to turn back, something caught his eye. A faint light flickered in the distance, barely visible through the thick trees. At first he thought it was just a trick of the light, but as he drew closer he realized it was real. The light was coming from a small clearing up ahead. Curious, Jacob rode toward the clearing, his heart racing. As he approached, the light grew brighter, and soon he could see what was casting the glow. It was a campfire, surrounded by stones, with several figures sitting around it. Jacob's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his knife. He didn't know who these people were, but he couldn't afford to take any chances. He dismounted quietly, leaving his horse behind, and crept closer to the fire. As he neared the clearing, Jacob could see the figures more clearly. They were a group of people, men and women, their faces painted with traditional markings, their clothes simple but well made. They sat around the fire, speaking in low voices, their words too soft for Jacob to understand. He stayed hidden in the shadows, unsure of what to do.
Who were they?
And why were they here, so deep in the woods? One of the figures, a woman with long black hair, suddenly looked up, her gaze piercing through the darkness. Jacob froze, caught off guard by the intensity of her stare. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, without a word, the woman stood and walked toward him, her footsteps quiet on the forest floor. Jacob's heart raced as she approached. Was she going to confront him? Would she call out to the others? To his surprise, the woman didn't speak. Instead, she reached into a pouch at her side and pulled out a small object, a necklace, much like the one he had found in the cabin. It glinted in the firelight, its beads reflecting the flames. She held it out to him, her eyes unwavering. Jacob hesitated. The woman seemed to know something, to understand something that he didn't. He stepped forward cautiously and took the necklace from her. As his fingers brushed against the beads, he felt a jolt of recognition. It was the same necklace he had found in the cabin, but this one felt different, warmer, as if it had been worn recently. The woman said something in a language Jacob didn't understand, but her voice was soft, almost comforting. She gestured for him to follow her. Still unsure of what was happening, Jacob did as she asked, his instincts telling him to trust her. He followed her through the forest, keeping a close eye on the rest of the group, who remained by the fire, watching silently. The woman led him to a small hidden grove, where the trees opened up to reveal a peaceful clearing. In the center of the grove stood a stone circle, ancient and worn by time. Jacob couldn't help but feel a deep sense of reverence as he stepped into the clearing. It was a place of quiet power, a place that seemed to hold memories long forgotten. The woman stopped in the center of the circle and turned to face Jacob. She held out her hand, palm up, as if offering something to him. Jacob, feeling the weight of the moment, placed the necklace in her hand. She closed her fingers around it and nodded. In that moment, Jacob understood. This woman, this group, were not just strangers. They were part of the story, part of Naya's story. They had come to honor her, to remember her, just as he had. The necklace, the symbol of Naya's life, had brought them together. The woman placed the necklace on the ground and, in a gesture of respect, stepped back. The firelight flickered behind them, casting shadows on the trees. Jacob felt a wave of emotion rise within him, a mixture of sadness and gratitude. He realized that the truth he had been searching for wasn't just about uncovering the past. It was about remembering the lives that had been lost and honoring the people who had been forgotten. As the fire burned low, Jacob stood in silence, watching the flames dance. The woman and her group remained in the clearing, their presence a silent acknowledgement of the story that had been passed down through generations. They had not forgotten Naya. And now, neither would he. When Jacob finally left the grove, the night had settled in completely, but the weight of the past no longer felt oppressive. He had found what he had come for, not just answers, but understanding. The cabin, the journal, the necklace, all of it had led him here, to this moment of connection. Naya's story would live on, not just in the land, but in the hearts of those who remembered her. As Jacob rode back to the cabin, the moonlight shining brightly above, he felt at peace. He had uncovered the truth, and in doing so, he had found his own way of healing. The past was never truly gone. It lived in the memories, in the stories, in the land itself. And now, Jacob Miller would carry those memories with him, honoring Naya's spirit and the legacy of those who had come before. The cabin would never be just a place of sorrow. It would be a place of remembrance, a place of peace.